the World Certification for Marriage Counseling. He was a professor, and he got his mathematics degree from MIT. And he applied these techniques, and he was actually able to predict divorce at a very 90% success rate. So he actually was able to see couples, see how they interacted, and could tell within a couple of years if they're going to stay together or get divorced. And so he kind of analyzed all these different behaviors and came down to some of the most crucial elements in a marriage and what can really break a marriage. But obviously, when you talk about these things, people don't talk from an Islamic perspective. And you also have to kind of bring in what the Prophet ﷺ says in the Sunnah and other things, and hopefully this incorporation will help not just all of you, but it's helped me personally analyzing it. I actually spoke to a professor there at UAB before I came here, and we went through the slides to make sure that culturally and religiously she understood where we were coming from, and I kind of bounced my ideas off of her. And so hopefully you all will benefit from this. And then I'll try to make it short and sweet. I don't want to speak more than 20 to 25 minutes. That's my intention. And then I'll leave the floor for all of you to ask any questions. If I can't get it done, information within 20 minutes, I do not do a good job. That's always the litmus test, maximum half an hour. After half an hour, if you can't explain what you want to explain, then you didn't accomplish the task. So that's my goal. My goal is to give you just the meat of everything that's extremely important and get rid of all the fluff. So as you can see here, coming up, marriage workshop. That was very quick. So myths. So the first place I want to start with is, what are the myths of marriage? There's a lot of myths that go around. And so I'm going to expose these myths based upon the studies that have been done. First myth is what we call a quid pro quo. We think that in marriage, a good relationship is, well, if I do something for you, you do something for me. I got you flowers and chocolate, you do the dishes. I give you a smile back at me. I pay the bills, so you do this for me. When you have a relationship like this is actually one of the signs of an ailing marriage, a marriage that is suffering. Because a marriage is not about counting how many times I've done something for you and how many times you've done something for me, right? It's a partnership, a contract, where both of you are succeeding, and sometimes one person sacrificed more in one part of the phase of the marriage, and other times the other partner does. So there is no such thing as you do this, I do this. If that's the kind of relationship you're having, if that's actually a bad thing, you shouldn't be counting how many times you help someone else and you help this other person. That's a business relationship. That's a partnership. That's not a marriage necessarily. So that's the big first myth. The second myth is that the majority of reasons why divorce occurs is for extra relationship affairs. No. The number one major reason for divorce, 80% of the reason, is because people become emotionally distant and they drift apart. And they fail to have friendship and intimacy. The vast majority of the reasons why marriages don't work out is because both parties are emotionally drifting away. Yes, there are other reasons why divorce happens, but you look at this, 80%. So what we're seeing is here that the majority of marriages would work out if there was a good emotional relationship, if there was friendship, if there was intimacy. You do have your other 20% cases, obviously, which we try to avoid. That's not the majority. So the majority of reasons people think is because of some random thing that happened. That's not the case. Happy relationships have fewer conflicts. Not true. Not true. Every relationship, and we're going to talk about this, has perpetual conflicts that are not resolvable. So the issue is not how many conflicts you have in your marriage. That's not a sign for a marriage error. How many conflicts you have, if you can't solve it, that's not a sign. Rather, the sign is how you deal with your conflicts. That is actually where the issues come, but not conflicts. And there's some funny quotes at the end that I'll share with you. Actually, I'm going to share it right now. Marrying someone is marrying a set of problems. It is like dealing with chronic back pain. You learn how to live with it. Okay, so hopefully people won't take offense to that, but what's the point? Anyone here has chronic pain? I have chronic knee pain. When I first injured my knee and got surgery, I was like, how am I going to live with this? And then my body adjusted. You said, okay, I know the pain's there, but I have learned how to deal with this. Similarly, when you marry someone, you're always going to marry someone who has issues. And you have issues also. But you learn how to work with this person and those problems. There's a funny quote here. I just kind of took it. It says, Paul married Alice, and Alice gets loud at parties. And Paul, who is shy, hates that. But if Paul had married Susan, he and Susan would have gotten into a fight before they even got to the party. That's because Paul is always late and Susan hates to be kept waiting. She would feel taken for granted, which she is very sensitive about. Paul would see her complaining about this as her attempt to dominate him, which he is very sensitive about. If Paul had married Gail, they wouldn't have ever even gone to the party because they would still be upset about an argument they had the day before. So what's the point of making it? You can keep reading it. No matter who you marry, there's going to be some conflict. So if you think that you have a conflict with your partner and that there's somebody else out there that you're going to have a perfect marriage with, not true. It's just that conflicts are going to be different. And you have to figure out, well, how do we deal with these different conflicts, right? And so our goal is not to solve problems. If you go into marriage thinking we have to solve every conflict, you're never going to solve anything. The solution is you have to learn how to deal with these problems, not solve them. And that's the big shift we have to have in our minds. Okay. What are some other myths? Complementary personalities have more successful marriages. This person is very extroverted and my spouse is introverted. For that reason, it'll work. Not true. Not true. There's no correlation that shows in the studies that there are certain personalities that match or don't match. So much so that the Journal of Marriage and Family, they said for the past decade, people need to stop reviewing this. There isn't enough data to show that there's personality match. It's shocking. So if you think, oh, I married this person because they have this personality, I have this personality, not true. It's not a reason for a successful marriage. It's not the reason. Can it help in certain moments? Of course. I'm not saying it doesn't help, but it's not the reason why you have a successful marriage. Unsuccessful marriages stem from issues of families of origin, different cultures, right? Different backgrounds. That's a myth. There is no evidence that family issues directly correlate to an unsuccessful marriage. Rather, the relationship will depend on how they manage these issues, not the issues themselves. Again, I'm trying to get back to the point, stop blaming the problem. You figure out how to deal with the problem is the mind shift. Okay, now what is true? What are some things that are actually true? Not myths, that are true about dysfunctionality in relationships. There is more negativity than positivity. In order to, and they did a study here, and I find this to be amazing. They said that in order to have a stable relationship, you have to have a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interaction. And they said that couples who have a 0.8 to 1 ratio of positive negative are headed for divorce. That's one of the signs that they saw right away.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Couples that have a 0.8 to 1, yani 1 to 1. And for every one positive interaction, there's one negative interaction. You smile, and then you get into an argument. You help, another argument. It's one-to-one. Positive and negative. Relationships that have a one-to-one ratio of positive interactions and negative interactions are headed for divorce. This is one of the key characteristics to predict if there's divorce coming. Healthy relationships have a 5-to-1 ratio, meaning you have to have 5 positive interactions for every one negative interaction. And this brought a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ into my mind. When you think of the Prophet ﷺ, why was he always smiling? Because he's trying to increase the number of positive interactions with people. He's always trying to do things to increase the positive interactions. Touching you, holding you, he would kiss his spouses. These are all what? Positive interactions. So he was continuously having positive interactions. The way I would view a marriage is kind of like a bank account, an emotional bank. When you have a rainy day, you're going to have to use your bucks, your positive interactions as payment to help get you through rainy days. But if your bank account is zero and you're a rainy day, this rainy day is going to be very bad. It's going to turn into a hurricane. But having all these positive interactions and building up your bank account is really what's going to help you in rainy days. So someone tell me, what are some positive interactions? What does a positive interaction mean to you? Yeah.
Positive interaction is you complimenting someone.
Compliment someone. Mashallah. It's always the single people who speak first about marriage. That's good. That's good though, mashallah. So complimenting, very good. You look nice, okay?
Just being respectful of somebody.
Good respect.
Once you start interacting with them, they're going to give a good impression of your first time meeting, they're going to oh, this is a really good place. They could also set a really good impression on them. They're going to feel bad.
Yeah, mashallah, respecting others. Any married couples? Anyone who's married who wants to give a suggestion? Yeah, all the married people are silent. I'm not saying anything. Yeah.
5 yes and 1 no.
5 yes and 1 no. Say yes 5 times and you get 1 no. SubhanAllah. Yeah, go ahead.
Helping out in the daily cold and stuff like that. Also smiling, having conversations about problems, those kind of things.
Yeah, smiling, helping out the daily chores. Yeah.
Kids.
Huh?
Giving gifts.
Giving gifts. It's a sunnah to give gifts. I heard doing dishes. That's another gift. So, but it's not a big deal. You just clean the dishes and you put it. But, yeah, another one?
I don't have another one. I have a question. Like, where does trust come into play if you are putting a ratio of 5 to 1? And the trust means like, this person is like this, and okay, deal with that. But I trust the person. He's not, or she is not like evil.
Yeah, definitely marriage is built on trust. You have to trust the person, right? That they'll take care of whatever's at home or outside the house or your children. You trust that children will be okay with your spouse. But I think this is even more basic than that, to be honest. This is just maintaining a stable relationship. Is making sure everything's stable. And a lot of times when I counted myself, I was more like a 3-to-1 ratio, 2-to-1. And when I counted that myself, I said, wow, I really need to start saying and doing things more often to make it a 5-to-1. And actually, when I started doing that in my own marriage, we've just been married 10 years last week. So we have made it past the 5-year mark is the one of the thresholds. So, but I started increasing that, and I was like, oh my gosh, my wife is being so much nicer to me. It's because I increased the ratio, and it was small things like smiling when she was talking to me, or just saying one sentence that was nice. Those things go a long way. But you never want to get down to 1-to-1 ratio. If you get down to 1-to-1 ratio, this is a bad area to be in. You need to get it back up. So just keep that in mind. Well, I mean, we're getting dangerous territory. So I'll leave that for you. So when Gottman was going through some of the signs of, what can cause separation, he boiled it down to 4 characteristics: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewall. These here we call the 4 horsemen. And these 4 things you have to be careful. Okay? So I have a video here. And to give an example, I kind of blurred out so that because some of the women were not wearing hijab, so I just blurred it out. But hopefully this will play. To give you examples. Let me see if I can do it like this. Oh, it's working like this. So. Okay, this is criticism. Okay, so this is a complaint. Let's see if I can get this. Just give it a second, it's gonna come up. Okay, so that was criticism. Criticism is when you are criticizing them for what they haven't done. It's not a personal attack. It's like you don't do that. You don't do this. This is criticism. Okay, so that's what criticism looks like. Now he's going to go to the next one. Defensiveness. Sure. That mic's is it coming from there? The speaker?
When you're always watching TV, I'm working and I watch the news. You're always watching TV and the kids. I can't watch a little bit of TV.
Trying to understand, I'm trying to somehow grasp how important it is to you, but I fail to get it, I just don't get it. Because it's not, to me, it's not as important.
So that was defensiveness. Defensiveness is when you say, well, an example would be, well, you don't do the dishes. And then you respond by saying, well, you don't do the dishes either. Yeah, or you don't help out with the house. And you respond, well, I'm always working. That's defensiveness. That's the second horseman that he mentions here. This third one is the worst one. This is called contempt. This is the worst of the 4.
All the time, I already know what you're gonna say. We'll get through it. We'll make it okay. I love you. We like you.
Why can't you just be nice about it?
So that was contempt. Contempt is when you are making fun of them, making fun of your spouse. If you notice here, well, what are you doing here? Or they mock you the way you say things. This is now talking about trust. This is disrespectful. So contempt is you're making fun of something. And so he says, out of the 4 here, if this is happening, this is a indicator of divorce as well. When we get to this, when you start mocking the other person, not criticizing. Criticizing is just you're saying you're not doing this. Contempt is, oh, but you clean it this way, or that is now another one. And that's very dangerous to get to that. And the last one is stonewalling. So to kind of give you a sense of stonewalling is done 85% of the times by the husband, which is when the husband shuts down. They don't say anything, they don't respond, and that's what we call stonewalling. And so you'll see this here. If you notice, he's not responding at all. She's shutting down. Here, the guy's on the left side here. The guy's on the left here, and he's not going to respond to anything she has to say. So those are what we call the 4 horsemen. Those are the 4 horsemen. So to go back, the 4 horsemen are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewall. These are the 4 things that we have to be aware of. Criticism and defensiveness are actually somewhat normal. This is part of the conflict. Contempt, though, you have to be very careful of never going to that mocking point. Stonewalling is very common amongst men, where they shut down and they refuse to respond. So 85% of the time is done by men. I'm not going, and what they're thinking is, there's actually some of the tests they've done, I'm not going to say anything. Will she just be quiet? If I say anything, it'll make it worse. That's when the husband has just gotten so quiet, like, this is not helpful. I'm not going to say it. Now, obviously, this is not healthy, right? So how do we get around stuff like this? A lot of times, how do we stop our partner from stonewalling? Sometimes the spouse has to change the topic. You know, like instead of just going at that topic, change it. That's a nice shirt. Oh, did you hear Queen Elizabeth passed away? You know, something random. You change the topic. Number 2, use humor. And sometimes if you use humor about the argument itself, it's pretty funny. When you're arguing, you say, we're really bad at arguing. You know, something like this, humor. But humor only works when there's enough positive to interact, more positive than negative interactions. If you don't have enough positive interactions, it comes off as sarcasm. Because you don't have the credibility of having the positive interactions to show that trust. So if there's always negative interactions and you try to use humor, it comes off as sarcastic and actually will make the situation worse, which is why having the 5-to-1 ratio is so important, because it'll make dealing with conflict so much easier. Support. Instead of nagging at your spouse, Do something that will help them. Maybe your spouse is complaining about back pain for the past week. Give them a massage. Give them a new chair. Maybe they've been complaining about something. Then help them with that. My wife, for example, is saying, can you help me buy a plane ticket to go somewhere? Oh, then I'll help her with that. I'll remember the things that she needs help with. Excitement as well. Now, what do we need for functional relationships? A couple of things. Successful repairs, dialogue, acceptance, and this last one. I'm just going to focus on this last one. This is the one I want to focus on. There's something called turning towards and turning away. Again, turning away is actually a sign of divorce coming up if it happens too often. What is the difference between turning towards and turning away? Turning towards and turning away, imagine this scenario. Your spouse says, you're both sitting at the living room, and your spouse says, oh, the weather is really nice today. Turning away would be, you don't even acknowledge what they said. You don't even acknowledge what they said. You say, oh, the weather is nice, and you're showing your phone. Turning towards would be, oh yeah, it looks nice. I know it's not a big turning towards, but that small interaction goes a long way. Because what's happening here? Pay attention. If your spouse is saying, oh, the weather is nice, what are they actually doing here? They're bidding for a connection, an emotional connection. They're saying, I want to experience this thought with you. So they're bidding for a connection. But if you are not going to accept those bids for connection, you are turning away. And the more you turn away, the more negative interactions you're having. Now, there is a study that I think you should try to turn towards about 80% of the time. 80% of the time you should turn towards. Divorces had around a 33% turning towards rate. That means for every 3 times, you're only responding once. People who are divorcing, for every 3 times your spouse is bidding for connection, you're only acknowledging it 1 time. But for those who had stable relationships, for every 5 times your partner was bidding for connection, you responded 4 times. You acknowledged it. It doesn't mean you have to be perfect, but there is this subtlety. You know, subhanAllah, we think marriage is all about, the big mistakes or the big things. It's these small interactions, when they pile up, they add legend to something bigger. And one of the best ways to increase positivity is by adding humor. So here are some ways that you can kind of build, and actually this is good because God didn't make this house. This is called a sound relationship house. And as you mentioned, to keep the house up, you have to have trust and commitment, as you mentioned. Trust is so important. And inside the house, you can build love maps, building that connection. What are some ways you can build a connection? And what are some ways you can't? Don't ask your spouse closed-ended questions. Where did you go today? That's a closed-ended question. It doesn't actually ask to connect. You should ask open-ended questions. How was your day today? How would you like to live in the future? What are your thoughts about us as a couple? These are more open-ended questions. What is your family like? What is your family of origin like? So change your questions. I found this actually to be very interesting. For those who come from different countries, the question was this: if a man or a woman had all the other qualities you desire, would you marry this person even if you're not in love with them? So I'll repeat the question. They went and they had polls. They said, if you found someone who has all the things you're looking for in a spouse, but you're not in love with them, would you still marry them? Now look how people in different countries answer. In India and Pakistan, they answered 50% yes, they would still marry them. Well, look at the United States. 3.5% said they would still marry them. Look at the cultural difference there. And you can see what happens. If you have, for example, a cultural marriage that has values from a different country, but you are living in a different country, you can start seeing what's happening. The shift in thinking is occurring. The couple that is from India and Pakistan, for example, they said, we'll marry as long as they have the qualities. We care about love, but not that much. United States, it's all about love. It's all about love. You have to love the person alongside the qualities. Only 3.5% of people in the United States said that they would marry somebody. That they would marry someone who they did not love but had all the qualities. Only 3.5%. So another aspect of marriage is the cultural aspect. And I would guess actually the majority of Muslim countries are similar to India and Pakistan, to be honest, around 50%. And then you look at the Western countries, United States, England, Japan, look at these countries, Australia, they're all 5% and below. Completely different paradigm on how we view what we should get from our spouse. So a lot of times, I think the majority of us are, from our origins come from a different country. One of the biggest transitions we have to face is, if I'm currently married to my spouse, but I live in America, American culture is going to affect my marriage and the perception of marriage. Maybe if you were back in Pakistan or India, the perception was as long as we have everything paid and everything's fine, it's okay. You come to America, the American culture is saying, no, love is a big thing. So now what's your spouse expecting? Love, emotional connection. And as the years go on, that desire is going to increase because you're living in a country that expects that. Every advertisement, every YouTube ad, every social media post is pushing that. It's not a bad or good thing. It's a cultural. Islam doesn't come into these things. Islam actually stays silent because Islam cares about oath. Oath plays a big role in fiqh. If you want to say is something permissible or not permissible, we also look at oath, the culture of the people to determine. For example, the mahr. Mahr is determined a lot of times by oath, by culture. How much do you want to pay mahr? There's no stipulation in Islam. You have to pay this much or that much. So oath plays a huge role. And I want you to see these statistics because I want you to be aware of what you're dealing with, right? And it gets even more complicated when you have multiple cultures. Imagine if you have two spouses from two different cultures. Oh, then it gets even more exciting. Because then you're balancing so many things. I thought that was very interesting.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Go back to the chart. Although, what you say is true, but if I look at the divorce rate, it's the highest in the US. Nearly about 1 in 3 child, child live in, that's the Pew's research, live in fatherless home in the US. Whereas if I take India, there was another research done by a Muslim scholar, because there were some issues about triple talaq.
Yeah.
What they found out was only 2.5% divorce rate amongst Muslims in spite of triple talaq, whereas Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians about 10%.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. I think there isn't necessarily a correlation between a happy marriage and divorce rates. A lot of times, people are so scared to divorce because of the social consequences, right? So that has to be taken into consideration. I know many. I counsel a lot, not just here, elsewhere. I know many women, for example, who are miserable, but they refuse to divorce because the social consequences are too much. So that has to be taken into consideration as well. So there isn't a correlation between a stable and happy marriage and divorce rates necessarily. And it's a big stigma of divorce. And rightfully so to a certain degree because we see in the hadith of the Prophet the most hateful thing in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is halal is divorce. Halal is divorce is halal, but is the one thing Allah hates the most that is permissible. So there is a stigma culturally and also somewhat Islamically as well. We want to avoid it at all costs if we can, because it does affect the children. The children suffer the most. So it's a good point, good conversation, but we have to do more research.
So I think it is fair, like what you mentioned, but what I also learned is there's an industry in the US, divorce industry, which is like $100 billion industry.
Yeah.
The marriage industry is only about $50 billion. Because there is so many things that play into this divorce thing. It's so easy.
Yeah.
Like buy one, get one free.
You're right, and it's trending towards that way. But inshallah, when we get to that point, we have private conversations on how to deal with it. This is more, I think, a conversation for we have marriages and we want to optimize and make them the best we can. I think the point I'm breaking here is more of a mindset. That's it. I'm not going to make any more claims to that. It's just a mindset. That's all I want to show here. How cultures can be so different on how they perceive marriage. And that should always be in the back of our minds as people who come from one culture but live in a different culture. So you have to keep those two things in mind. And the last thing I want to show you is this. And then if any Q&A, I'll answer. But I'm going to read this out loud. I thought this was a beautiful statement from Godwin's book. Only 31% of discussions involve functional problem solving. That means out of all the problems that you and your spouse have, only 1/3 of them are solvable. Only 1/3 of your problems are solvable. 16% of professional issues involve gridlock couple conflict on these professional problems, while 84% of the conversations about perpetual problems in which the couple is trying to establish a dialogue with the problem. So what are we learning first and foremost? The first thing I want you to notice is that your goal should never be to always solve problems. Solving problems is like, for example, you're trying to fly to another state and there's a logistical issue. That's a problem we need to solve. Right? But the majority of things you talk about are not like that. They're not objective, they're subjective issues. There's nothing to solve, actually. Nothing to solve. And men actually are the worst at this because we're problem solvers. So whenever we see a problem, we think we've got to solve this problem. But we shouldn't approach it like that. It's not a problem to solve, it's a problem to discuss. That's a big shift. You don't want to come with the idea of solving the problem. You want to come with the idea of discussing the problem and having both parties be heard. That is actually what is an indication of a successful marriage, not the amount of problems you solve. Actually, if you come with the idea of trying to solve a problem, it can make the dialogue and conversation worse. It actually can be worse. And then what he's also mentioning here is we have concluded that instead of solving problems, what seems to be more important is whether or not a couple can establish a dialogue with the perpetual problems. These problems are perpetual, they're not solvable. But can you create a safe environment where there can be a discussion where both parties are being heard? That is more important. This dialogue needs to feel good for it to be a dialogue. Meaning you can joke around, you can disagree with them, agree to disagree. But the dialogue should be a fun, lighter conversation. It shouldn't be so heavy. And to feel good, the couple makes their peace with the problem to some degree. In that you can somewhat maybe solve a little bit, but the point is not to solve the entire problem. They may be able to push or pull the problem about someone and change their level of frustration with the problem. They may come to some acceptance of the problem. They seem to be able to simultaneously communicate acceptance of the partner. That right there is the thing. Okay? You're telling your partner, I accept you for who you are, your flaws and your strengths. Your flaws and your strengths. I accept you. I'm not going to reject you for who you are. But I'm going to talk to you about this, and I'm going to express my opinion to you about it, and I'm going to let you know what my opinion is in a loving way and show you respect at the same time. That is what is the indication of a successful marriage. You know, when I think of this, I think of the Prophet ﷺ. When he had both his wives, and one of the wives, and you all know stories, I'm not going to explain the whole thing. One of the wives threw the food at the other wife. Right, threw it. Anyone remember what the Prophet's reaction was? Anyone know what his reaction was? He started laughing. He started laughing. And he started actually teasing. He started teasing them. This is an example of when there was a problem inside the Prophet's house, but he didn't try to solve it. He tried to make light, to make dialogue within the problem. Because they're human beings. We don't have to solve the problem. And so that, I think, when you start looking at the seer of the prophet, so when you start noticing these things, he had this innate knowledge about all this stuff. But here's the most important point, and I'll end it here. I think I just went a little over 20 minutes. However, if they cannot establish such a dialogue, the conflict becomes gridlock. And gridlock conflict eventually leads to emotional disengagement. That's the problem. The problem is when you can't establish a dialogue, you both are on extreme ends, and when you're on extreme ends, there's no emotional connection anymore. The ratio goes back to 1-to-1 again. And then it creates resentment, and over the years you realize what happened. I don't even talk to my wife. She's my roommate, not my wife. I've heard that a lot. I've heard a lot of spouses tell me that they're just my roommate, not my spouse anymore. We live in the same house, but we don't have any conversation. And part of the reason is because when you have these conflicts, you need to have a bridge of dialogue that allows both parties to be heard, and you always want to increase the positive interactions and negative interactions to create a stable relationship. And so these are some quick things. I'm just trying to give you the meat of a lot of it. There's obviously a lot more, but hopefully this raised some awareness and this helped give some thought to maybe how we can better our marriages and my marriage as well. I'm a human being. Just because I'm giving a presentation doesn't mean I'm perfect. I learned a lot like this, and I'm still working on a lot of these things, to be honest. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put love in our marriages and to have us have successful marriages, inshallah. Any questions?
What is the role of the children bridging the marriage?
Very good. We call this triangulation. And triangulation is not a healthy thing in a marriage. This happens a lot. For example, the husband and wife don't get along. They argue. So then the husband goes to the daughter to release the frustration. So they call this triangulation. Wife, husband, and then you have the daughter involved. This is not healthy. This is not healthy. You don't bring a third person in to deal with another relationship. That is not healthy because then it puts stress on another party. And then what happens is almost view like the marriage is like a line, okay? Now the husband has taken the line and attached it to the daughter. What has it done? It has taken away the emotional connection from the spouse and has given it towards the child. So the child should not be the problem solver for the marriage. That's not the child's job. The child has separate relationships with the parents. The marriage has to be dealt with the two people. But what happens in weak relationships and family issues is that there's always just one person who's always a mediator, who's always mediating between both people. It's okay to some degree, but it gets abused a lot. It gets abused a lot. And that's a sign of relationships deteriorating. And we don't want to bring a third party in. A lot of times people use me as the third party. They try to make me come in and fix everything. I said, I'm only here for an hour. I can't fix the whole thing. It's your relationship. So people will always try to bring you in to fix something. But the reality is they have to fix it themselves. And it's tough. It takes dialogue. It takes conversation. It's possible, but it's tough. But they always try to bring you in because triangulation is not healthy. And it gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and the relationship gets pulled this way. Like we actually draw maps of relationships. The relationship is up here and it gets pulled down. You can literally see the relationship being broken by this third party being put in. And a lot of times it's the child, unfortunately. The child, and that's the problem. People think if we have a child, marriage will be fixed. No. Not being fixed. A child won't fix marriage. You have to fix your own marriage.
But isn't it in Islam, there is a divorce, you see, then you bring a mediator to work things out.
Yeah, it's like an ambulance service. right? We'll give CPR, we'll give training, we'll do all these things. And that's what I do. Like if I meet with him weekly, if it's really bad, I'll meet with him every day until it's solved. If it's somewhat bad, weekly. And so I do come in as a mediator, definitely. And I try to mediate and try to speak on behalf of both parties. But at the same time, I can't live with them. I mean, I'm only here with me for 1 hour, 2 hours. What happens about the 22 hours? Like, they still have to figure it out. So a mediator comes in to help, like an ambulance, like a physician who is helping an illness. But the person has to have good diet and exercise. Same thing here. We'll give them the spiritual and counseling medicine. We have to also work on the marriage together. And then we give them activities and practices. It works out. It depends if both people have nia, the intention to make it. But it can work. It's a good question.
Do you consider nothing box as a turning away action?
A
Nothing box state. Men tend to go to a state called nothing box, where they don't interact with anyone. Like that's
like the band cave? Is that what they call it? Like they just
it's
go to the
nothing
cave?
box state where you go like after work you don't want to talk to anybody. Just go get your phone and watch TV, but you don't want to talk to anybody.
Oh, I
Then
see.
your wife comes talks to you, and you're not even listening. You think that not turning away, or
It's it's fine as long as communicated. So sometimes I'll come home and I'm like that. I'm just like I can't talk to anybody. But I tell my wife, I need my space right now. I tell her very clearly, I just need my space. It's nothing against you. And I suppose I sometimes I even give her a heads up warning. I'll give you an example, personal example, right? Like sometimes I know if I travel and I come back home, like I'm gonna go back home on Sunday. I know I'm gonna be exhausted. And I told her, when I come, I can't talk. I need to rest. And she understands that. So she said, okay, he's gonna rest for a few hours. He has to do his thing, clean up, organize. And then after that, then we can have a conversation. But it's communication. When I did not communicate with her, she thought I was ready to communicate and talk to her, and I was ignoring her. She thought that because I did not communicate with her what I was actually feeling. So you're right, it's not turning away, but it can be perceived as turning away if you don't communicate.
This should be the kind of routine thing that every day you get it. Isolation. Because once in a while you're frustrated, you work, your job, whatever it is, you want to do space. But if it is your routine that you get in home and you just want to be isolated, probably that is that's certainly not happening.
Every relationship is very unique. In some relationships, it might be healthy. I know some couples when they argue, they don't argue in person. They email each other. They email the argument. And honestly, that's actually much healthier for them because when you saw them argue in person, it was not healthy. It was very unhealthy. So every couple is very unique. So I'm not going to make blanket statements here saying what is good for everyone because I've seen a lot of situations and everyone has a very unique style of living. Everybody. Some people don't want their spouse to work. Some people are okay with it. Some people want to live there, here. It's just so many different varieties. Some people are okay with being isolated more than others. But as long as both parties have communicated that with each other and they both are aware and okay with it, then it's a mutual agreement. That's what's important. I'm not here telling you how much and what to do, but if you do want to go on your space, my suggestion is communicate that. Don't just do it because it'll come off as you ignore it. It'll come off as you not caring. But if you just simply say one sentence, I need my space. It's nothing personal, that goes a very long way. That's communication is the most important thing. We call this boundaries. Creating clear boundaries is important. A lot of the reasons why marriages struggle is because at the beginning of the marriage, there weren't clear boundaries set. And what happens is when the other spouse crosses the boundary, the spouse gets upset. Why did you cross my boundary? The spouse says, I didn't even know this was a boundary. I didn't even know you had a boundary. How am I supposed to? You never told me the boundary. Well, that's the boundary now. So that's usually how conversations go. And you can plug in anything in boundary. Space alone, food, travel, whatever it may be. But communicating your boundaries is extremely important. What is okay and what you're not okay. And then you have the dialogue. This is what I'm going back to. You can have conflict all you want, but you have to have dialogue about it. You can't be silent about it. Otherwise, that will create more issues. And spiritually now speaking, shaitan will come in and pursue Allah. And that's the worst. When you don't communicate, who's going to put the assumption in your spouse's head? Shaitan. Su'alan, su'alan, su'alan. Negative assumption, negative assumption, negative assumption. When the su'alan racks up, oh my gosh, it's so hard to defeat that. So, and this is important. Let's think of the sunnah of the Prophet as an example. When the Prophet was at the masjid late at night, and his spouse came, two sahabis came and walked by, right? What did the Prophet do at that moment? Anyone know? He called them. Said, come here. He said, that's my spouse. He said, oh, we would have never, ever thought anything differently of you, O Prophet. Said, no, I know you wouldn't, but I don't want shaitan to put something in your head. The Prophet is exhibiting here extra clear communication. He doesn't want any room for shaitan to put something in your spouse's head or in your head either. Be very clear, even if it may not seem necessary to you, it will help a lot with your spouse understanding how to deal with it. Any other questions?
Is this similar to giving space?
Yeah. Yeah, it's giving space. Everyone needs space. Yeah. It's just how does a spouse know if it's space or if it's you ignoring them? Maybe if you're around each other long enough, you understand each other's habits, but sometimes they might not. So that's the confusion we're going to try to avoid. That's majority of the time the issues are coming from miscommunication, not from an evil intention. It's always miscommunication and the shaitan putting something in the head, then it gets worse. And that's happening because we don't communicate. And in our cultures, unfortunately, our culture teaches us not to communicate. That's the reality. Our culture has taught us that we should be silent all the time. But the Prophet was extra clear in communication. He was an excellent communicator. He would always communicate. He would always figure out, and he was always aware of people's communications. Think about this. When he was at Aisha, what did he say to her? I know when you're upset and I know when you're not. When you say the Lord of Muhammad, you're happy. But when you say the Lord of who? Ibrahim, you're upset with me. So he was also very keen on the other person and how they communicated with him. He was also very well aware of that. He was an excellent communicator. And if we want to follow the sunnah of the Prophet, we should be better communicators. Yeah.
I think just one comment. If you raise your children with the Islamic values, their own tradition, and make them confident and free to communicate with them, they can be a source of really a very buffer between you and your.
Yeah, of course. Children are.
It's not only just take them as translation. You talk about it, but if you upbringing with the values you put there because you give them the love, every support, and they have the intelligence. And one of the child, not all of them, if you have more children, one or two, they will be more close to you.
Yeah.
And you're confident.
Yeah, very right. Any other comments, questions? That's it? Okay, سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Oh, sorry. We'll put it back on. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Is it necessary right now?
No, no, fine. We test it later.
Okay. Good morning.
Choose.
It helps a lot.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Inshallah, we have some refreshments for the gentlemen. It's outside under the shed, and for ladies, it's going to be downstairs.
Stop.